when you have to get to the Horde, but they're just out of your reach. Here's your look at the brand new Mattel Master Universe Origins Extendar, Heroic Master of Extension. Extendar was one of the last figures released in the vintage Master Universe line back in the 1980s. This Hordak experiment turned hero used an extendable body to leap great distances and his powerful reach to fend off attackers. They brought back Extendar, and now for the first time he's in Origins form with a unique body that extends. The figure has 16 points of articulation and extendable limbs to set him above and beyond any collection. Much like Extendar, it seemed this guy had to travel great distances in order to get one. Originally, it was available over on Mattel's sites, but it had sold out fast. It was only going for around $30 Canadian. Luckily, my friend Daryl hooked me up with getting this one, so we're going to be having a look at it in this review. Extendar, though, does have extension pieces. I'm not using it right now for the sake of measuring him. In his defaulted state, you're looking at the character standing 6 inches in height, or Extendar is 15 centimeters tall. I just realized now I chose poorly when it came to selecting the characters I wanted to use for comparisons. Mechanic would have been an ideal candidate considering he had also the extension neck, and also Hordak considering he was the one that created him. But we're going to bring in He-Man at least because everybody has a He-Man. Here's as well what Extendar looks like with another Mattel exclusive, Cyclone. And for no reasons other than the fact I just like elephants, here's what the figure as well looks like with snout spouts. Understanding that Mattel didn't want to sacrifice articulation for gimmick, some unfortunately of the extension pieces for Extendar require a little bit of swapped out parts that we'll have to then add on to the arms and add on to the legs. The gimmick does still retain in some of the areas that I'm circling right now. Before we get to those circled areas, let's look at the one other thing that comes included with him other than his shield is a mini comic. The comic entitled Terror of the Technomancer. I almost wanted to read that as Technodrome, although similar science experiments are done inside. Extendar, you can see him riding a horse at the very beginning, but there is then seems to be a flashback where you can see that Hordak is developing the character. He adds the extension pieces. Now, truth be told, honestly, I haven't even read the comic yet. It's a very simple, straight-through read of like 4, 5, 6 pages tops. He does also seem to have almost like an Autobot matrix of leadership. The figure does not have that, so don't go looking for it. And then there's no cross-promotions on the back, nothing to advertise other figures that Mattel is producing. A nice little mini-comic. We're going to move that off to the side. The figure, like the original 1985 Master Universe version of Extendar, also comes included with his shield. The shield works, I think, the exact same way, as basically it's a folded-up piece that then latches onto his arm. You basically take the shield as it is right now, and you just clip it around his arms, or I guess you could also clip it this way too, but I kind of find it's easier first to kind of get it into his grip first, and then clip it onto his forearm. Now, it's a little more of a smoother plastic that they're using here for Extendar, but you can see that's how he's basically holding the shield. The shield, though, opens up in 3 places. There's a hinge, and a hinge. In fact, like, you know what, maybe I'll keep the shield on him, because it's probably, you know what, no, we're going to take it off. Commit to the idea of removing it. It's a little bit easier to kind of talk more about it. The original Extendar also had the very same gimmick for the shield. So what you do is you take the sides and you detach them. There's a peg right here and a hole on the adjacent side. You do the exact on the other side there as well, and you fold these out, and you take the bottom, you fold that out too. Sort of gives us a very circuitry-looking shield. The thing, unfortunately, about this, though, and I would imagine the original Extendar shield was also known for this too, is that it works basically on this little lip of plastic right here. This little piece that basically connects this side of the shield to the main part of the shield. It's only by just this thin strand of plastic. Moving this back and forth, I'm not going to do it too often. You may be able to see it, or maybe it's a little easier to see on this side. I've got one starting stress mark starting to develop. I don't know. I mean, this is not something that's intended for long times of just doing this back and forth. Don't just keep doing this, because I would imagine that would probably start to split the plastic, and eventually the shield would come loose. Long-term plans, I'm probably just going to have the shield permanently open like this. I do like the idea that, like the original vintage toy, they would have had the parts fold in. I just worry, my original worry would have been if I had the first Extendar back in the 80s. Also, just the fact that side shield piece, I just feel like down the road will start to shred, start to, again, just develop a stress marks. You probably can maybe even see a little bit right there. Either way, he does come included with the shield. Like that they did that. Like I said, though, the figure does sort of phone in some of the parts when it comes to extension pieces. I can justify why, though, because keep in mind the original Extendar from the 80s would have not had any articulation in the elbows, nor would he have had any additional articulation in the knees. In order to have these, and in order to have these, he has to have these. Picking the figure up first. Honestly, I'll tell you, I'm not a big fan of Extendar. If he wasn't part of the original lineup of Master Universe figures from way back when, I probably would have not picked up this figure. Now, if he had been, say, released as a newly created character, I probably would have had little to no interest. I never really loved the idea of Extendar. I liked the gimmick of him. I just never thought the design of him was all that intriguing. Extendar's whole function is the fact that you can take parts of him now. So the original vintage figure would have had like the arms that you basically would have pulled out. You would have taken the lower legs and basically done the exact same. They have at least still retained some of that in the fact that you can take the head and you just basically grab the head on the back and you just pull it out. What you're basically pulling out is something very similar to these extension pieces, but it's already built inside of his body. You pull this out and now you can see actually Extendar's face underneath, which really isn't that much different from the original Extendar, other than the fact that this now has some additional posability. He's got a ball joint, so the ball joint, can you even see it? Can you see it? It's right there, right there. Ball joint allows the head at least to move up and down. We'll talk obviously more about that in a moment. And through, unfortunately, trying to pull the neck, I also pulled the only other thing that actually extends on this figure is also his waist. Now the waist, again, on the original figure, I think would have only just pulled up. I don't know if it would have had the straight swivel. This figure does have no swivel there on the top, but he has at least extension pieces here, and he has extension pieces here. Everything else you have to do for this figure involves you yanking things off like his gloves and pulling off the bottoms of his boots in order then to add these extra pieces. You get two sets of them, and they are different from one another. So you get one that's just a straight pair, and then you get one that's curved. The curved ones are the ones for the arms. The straight ones are the ones for the legs. You can see they're almost about the same size, although very much differently shaped. What you'll do, though, is you'll take the arms and you just remove the gloves, just like that. Take the curved piece, and you'll just... So there's a hole on the end, and there's a peg on the other side. Pretty straightforward. That's simple shapes. Plug that in place, then you're basically going to take the arms, take the gloves, and just plug those in place. And then just twist the arms until you get them just right. Do the exact same on the other side. It's a slight tutorial of how you're basically going to be adding the parts for Extendar. And then do the same on the other side. We'll just plug those in place. And then you're going to do the same then with the legs. So what you'll do is remove them from basically all the parts that are gold are the parts that you're going to be removing. So like this part of the boot is going to be the part that's going to detach from the rest. Take the straight pieces. And if you're pretty much an expert now with what you've done with the arms, you're even more of an expert when it comes to legs. You're basically doing the exact same thing. So just plug those in place. Detach again the boot here. Add the extra piece. And then once again, rinse and repeat. We'll add back the boots. Now you can obviously see, for the sake of articulation, which I'm glad they didn't sacrifice one for the gimmick. Now, this figure could have easily had all those things sort of built already into his body like the original vintage figure, but if that's the case, and the figure looks the same, it would almost even just beg the question, they would never even need to release him. So, obviously, I'm glad that they still managed to retain the articulation in the elbows, if I move my hands out of the way, and still kept the same for his knees. And to show you the difference, though, in size, bring back in Cyclone. So, I mean, like, looking at Extendar would have started right around here. And you can see how much more of him is longer now, and his arms and his legs. The only thing, obviously, you'll have to do is then just take all the pieces off for the arms, take also the things off for the legs. And you can then choose also, too. You don't always have to have all the same parts. If you want to only do it with one arm, he's kind of like Inspector Gadget. You also do it. One leg would probably be a little bit harder because obviously it'd be harder to stand up. And then basically for this, you would just pop this back in place. You take the head and you would also pop that back in place. So you can choose for yourself how you want to have the figure displayed. He looks good. I mean, the colors are pretty close to the original 80s version of Extendar. Nice use of this very shiny silver plastic. He has the face shield, obviously, so you can still see his face underneath all that. Some nice gold accents there on the front, all like the original vintage figure. They haven't really done anything other than just building up a brand new body. Gold on the shoulders. You got some nice gold there also on the gloves. Kind of best describe this as like a Werther's original kind of gold. Very shiny, though, on the figure. He looks good. I've just never really been a big fan of the character myself. If, again, it wasn't for the fact that this guy already had a vintage release back in the 80s, I probably would have never picked this guy up in the first place. Now, for the figure's articulation, will involve me, of course, taking the head once again, popping that back out. This is as far. Don't pull any further than that, whatever you do. So the head's going to be on a ball joint. It rotates all the way around. The head looks down, the head looks up, and you can also move it back and forth. You could do all that in theory if you took the neck and popped it back down into the cavity. Just popping it back down. He still has a little bit of articulation, but more just rotating it back and forth. The arms rotate all the way around. That's on both sides. You can also hinge the arms outward as well. I think, too, even though they don't really advertise it, yeah, you could just take the arms off and you could mix and match the parts with other Masters figures, too. Just pop that back in place. There we go. He has a swivel there in his arms, which also serve as well to be an elbow bend. The elbow has very little of a bend, though. You can see very little of a hinge joint. Technically, by the way these attach, there's also some swiveling there, so you can rotate these all the way around, and there's also some swivelage happening here for the glove. You can also hinge as well the hands back and forth. Those aren't feet, hands back and forth. The figure does have a waist swivel, leg articulation. So again, like here's all again where now the included articulation makes this guy feel more updated. Legs move forward and back. He has a bend in the knee, rotation in the lower leg. He also does have a rotation here, and of course all the same standard articulation in the ankle as well. You could, granted, in theory, also bend the knees forward if you want to have this guy more like his vintage look. But, you know, for me, I always like to really display my Origins figures always with legs straight, always with arms straight, unless I have the figures wielding weapons. All in all, though, let's just get his head back popped up here. Also extend out Extendar's waist. It's a nice looking figure, but again, like, I don't know, for me at least, my itch that I have to really scratch when it comes to collecting all these figures of the Origins line is mine more rooted kind of in the vintage stuff we were getting in the 80s. I never had Extendar as a kid. I do remember seeing him in a store though, and I just had very little. By that point, I feel as Extendar kind of got near the end of the line, I wasn't really at all collecting Master Universe figures. So even at that point, seeing Extendar had little to no interest. And honestly, now I feel like nothing really has changed as an adult. This guy is obviously very firmly rooted in the original 80s line, although he was really near the end of the 85 line. This guy, though, didn't have much interest in him then. I don't really have as much interest in him now. If again, it wasn't for the fact that I was just wanting to collect any figure that was originally released as part of the vintage line, I probably would have not been interested to get Extendar. Just say that for the sake of a hypothetical, if Mattel had released this and said, we're creating a brand new figure, who am I kidding? I probably still would have picked it up, because even if he doesn't really, even though I wouldn't probably put him in the foreground of some of my favorite figures from the Origins line, he does go though nicely though with all the figures around him. Adding the obligatory extension to the end of this review and final looks, here we are looking, of course, at the Master Universe Origins Extendar. One correction, though, I did want to make is I did say he was from 1985. In fact, he was actually part of Wave 5, released in 1986, so 1 year later. I never, though, again, had the original Extendar. I do, though, very vividly remember seeing him in Kmart, but again, by then, I'd already moved away from the idea of collecting Master Universe figures, and I was well into collecting G.I. Joes and Transformers. Extendar, though, is an interesting enough character. I'm glad, at least with the updated version of him, that Mattel didn't completely do away with all the gimmicks, because they seem very prone to the idea that if a character had an initial gimmick, they really a lot of times want to remove it altogether. Remember, that was the case when we looked at Mechaneck. This, though, unlike Mechaneck, does actually have still extendable pieces, though, in his waist and also in his neck. So he does extend on his own without having to need extra plastic. Those extra plastic bits, though, are still required if you want to extend his arms and extend his legs. So half of it, at least, is stuff that he can do on his own. Well, it still requires you, of course. And then the other half is you involving to pull the hands off, pull the boots off, and then add those extension pieces in there. I think when it comes to displaying the figure, he looks certainly a little bit more interesting doing what he's doing right now. Having everything sort of retracted back into his body kind of just gives you the idea that he's a shiny knight. He's not as interesting, honestly, as maybe perhaps Cyclone. I think Cyclone, of the Mattel's exclusives that were available over on their site, I think I'm a little more interested and invested in Cyclone. Maybe not as much in Extendar, but because he was part of the original 80s line, I want to collect everything that Mattel's releasing now with the updated bodies. Have you guys had the chance to collect the Extendar here? Originally, again, this guy was going to be released, well, he was released over on their site for, again, for Canadian, $30. And for the prices of what they're selling them, I can understand why this guy sold out so fast. Have you guys had the chance to pick up this guy? Let me know down below in your comments what you guys think of him. And if you guys did enjoy this video, I want to throw it a like. If you guys are loving the content and want to stick around for more, may I extend the offer as well to hit that subscribe button down below and extend an equal offer of turning the bell notification on that's just right next to it. As always, guys, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.